Як умру, то поховайте мене на могилі. Серед степу широкого, на Вкраїні милій.
Those are the opening words of the poem My Testament by Taras Shevchenko, the subject of this two-part podcast special. Read by our friend Taras Shevchenko, the poet's words, written in 1845 in Pereyaslav, south of Kyiv, are stark, rich and beautiful. In translation, it reads, "When I am dead, bury me in my beloved Ukraine, my tomb upon a grave mound high amid the spreading plain, so that the fields, the boundless steppes, the Dnieper's plunging shore my eyes could see, my ears could hear the mighty river roar." We will hear the full poem in Ukrainian at the end of today's podcast. Our huge thanks to Katya for her powerful reading. I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Over the Christmas week, we're doing things a little differently here. Today is the first part of a special two-part podcast on the life and works of Ukrainian poet, writer and artist Taras Shevchenko. When you're in Kyiv, the name Taras Shevchenko is almost impossible to escape. Monuments, streets, universities bear his name. Even the hotel Dom Nichols and I stayed in was just a few minutes from Taras Shevchenko Park. To get to the park, you travelled along Taras Shevchenko Boulevard, and the Taras Shevchenko Museum was just across the road. Before travelling to the country, I had a dim idea of Taras Shevchenko as a poet and important cultural figure. But I wanted to understand better his life and his times, to place his story in the greater and wider story of Ukrainian history and culture in the past few hundred years. Shevchenko's life is fascinating. Born in serfdom in 1814, he died in 1861 in St Petersburg. His life is one of incredible creativity, artistic talent, and gives us a fascinating glimpse back into 19th century Ukrainian history at a time when the Russian Empire was in its heyday. Understanding him, his life, his impact on Ukrainian culture and society should help us better understand contemporary Ukraine. This is what this two-part podcast will try and do. I spoke to Lyubov Tarashchuk, researcher at the Taras Shevchenko Museum in Kyiv. Here's our conversation. Lyubov, thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. We're going to talk today about Taras Shevchenko, the great Ukrainian poet. To start off, can you tell us a little bit about his life? Can you give us an overview for people who've heard the name potentially but don't know much about him?
First of all, thank you for inviting me and giving me a chance to tell your audience, your English-speaking audience, some more about my country and our most prominent figure, Taras Shevchenko. When you arrive in Ukraine, it would pass an hour or even less, and you immediately hear the name of Taras Shevchenko, because Ukrainians are mad about him. We have streets, boulevards, we have monuments to Taras Shevchenko in every city, town, and even village. But if you ask somebody, even Ukrainian, if you ask Ukrainians, why are you so mad about this guy? You can hardly get a short answer, because Shevchenko have always been with us. I remember since my childhood, I can never even recollect when I first heard the name of Taras Shevchenko. It's just with the milk of moms, yes, something like this. At least we feel like this. We know the biography of Taras Shevchenko is quite well, but we don't completely comprehend his role for our modern life.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. So what is that biography?
Taras Shevchenko is a prime Ukrainian poet and artist and public intellectual living in the 19th century. And he lived and created his poems and artworks in the period of Romanticism, which was marked by the spread of national movements in many European countries, as well as in the United States. And Shevchenko appeared to be a main representative of the Ukrainian Romanticism and a major figure of Ukrainian national revival. As I already told, he had always been and still remains a symbol of the Ukrainian national spirit, whoever you ask in our country. Through Shevchenko's life story, we'll try to tell the English-speaking audience about Ukraine's history and culture, our way of getting what we are now. Shevchenko himself in autobiography wrote the following words: "The story of my life is a part of the history of my homeland." And that was really true. You cannot tell the artist's biography and explain his role in the Ukrainian national movements without revealing the historical context he was born and worked in. So, the Ukrainian poet and artist Taras Shevchenko was born in 1814 in the village of Morinci, Kyiv province, at the time a part of the Russian Empire. His parents were serf peasants belonging to the Russian landlord, Baron Vasily Engelgard. The story of Shevchenko's family can also be an evidence of the historical changes of the period. For example, it's important for understanding to know that Shevchenko's grandfather, Andrei, was the Polish subject, and he was a free man. But already Shevchenko's father became a Russian subject and he was enslaved in serfdom. So his son Taras, the future Ukrainian artist and poet, was born as a serf, a person who was some other person's property. It was one of the results of incorporation of the Ukrainian lands into Russia and the establishing of serfdom by Russian Empress Catherine II in 1783. Here I feel like I have to explain something or to give more information about serfs.
Yes, please do. So that's not something particularly well understood, I think, in the West. As you said, he's born a serf in the Russian Empire. Can you expand on that a little bit? What does that mean?
You know, when I guide foreigners in my museum, I see that they don't understand what is serfdom. They know what is slavery, but serfdom is something else. So serfdom, what it was in Russia. Peasants were bounded to the land they lived in, and together with the land, they became property of a landowner. If peasants gave birth to a child, the child automatically became a serf. Serfdom in Russia had a very sad, I would even say disgusting shape. A landlord could lose his serf in cards or exchange for hunting dogs, and that was awful. Serfs had very limited rights, but even those they had were violated. For example, officially it was forbidden to sell or buy serfs, except when you buy a land, then serfs are included. Sounds awful, yeah, for modern days. But we speak about Russia, where human rights had always been violated and still are. So there were numerous ads announcing selling or buying serfs. You could open any paper in St Petersburg of that time and you could find an advertisement, I sell or I'll buy a serf, for the price was very different. And this is what would happen to Shevchenko later. His landowner, Pavel Engelgard, refused to release Taras for free, and he asked quite a big money for the freedom of his serf, Taras Shevchenko. To explain about Russia and Ukraine, and to explain about Ukraine being a part of Russia, how it happened, how was it to be incorporated in the huge empire. I must tell, at least briefly, the historical and social context of the period. So for many centuries, the land of modern Ukraine were under the influence of two neighboring countries. I mean the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Moscow Tsardom. I say Moscow Tsardom, but not empire, because after the colonization of the Ukrainian lands, Moscow Tsardom was able to become an empire, to transform into empire. It happened seems to me, in 1723, and we speak about Peter the Great. The growing dysfunction of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ended up with a series of partitions of Poland, and finally removal of this state from the map of Europe. And as a result, massive territories, a large part of them ethnically Ukrainian belonging to the Commonwealth, were transferred to the rapidly expanding Russian Empire. So Russia controlled up to 80% of Ukrainian lands. We speak about central, southern, and eastern modern Ukraine. And the rest belonged to or fell under influence of the Austrian Empire. I speak about modern western lands of Ukraine. So Russia treated Ukraine as a source to feed Russian culture, religion, science, and education. The thing is that Kyiv is, we know now Kyiv is much older than Moscow, not to mention St. Petersburg. Kyiv was first mentioned in 482, and the Moscow in 1147. By the way, it was founded by Yuri Dolgoruki, the prince who originated from Kyiv Rurik dynasty, yes. And Ukrainians had their old background lasting continuously from the times of Kievan Rus. It was the medieval state on our territory with Kyiv as a center of trade, religion, culture, and political life. We have a famous St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv. It was built back in 1011, when Moscow wasn't even mentioned. And this cathedral is still standing in Kyiv. And this is my personal recommendation when you visit Kyiv. This is St. Sophia Cathedral is must visit during your stay in Kyiv. So I invite you after our victory. Yes. And little by little, the empire transferred the center to Russia. How it happened? In 1817, the famous Kyiv Mahila Academy, the first Ukrainian high school, which was founded back in 1615. It was closed in Kyiv. By the way, the first university in Moscow was inaugurated much later, 140 years later, after Kyiv Mahila Academy. And the founder of the first university in Moscow was Mikhail Lomonosov, and he was the graduate from the Kyiv Mahila Academy. So after the closing of the academy in Kyiv, the center of culture, religion, philosophic thinking, and science transferred to St. Petersburg, which was by the time the capital of the Russian Empire. This is a short way to explain what it was to be a part of the Russian Empire. I think it was typical for most empires. The behavior of Russian Empire was very typical for most empires all over the world. But the problem is that many centuries passed and the situation remains the same, even now. Yeah.
So, Lyubov, you've set the scene and given us loads of background on the situation that Ukraine found itself in 1814 at the start of Taras Shevchenko's life. As you described, he was born a serf in Kyiv province. Can you sketch for us his early life and his 20s and his 30s? When does he start writing and what does he write?
When he was quite a young boy, when he was 8, he was sent to the local school in the village, the deacon school. It was a kind of church school where a deacon was instead of a teacher. And it was their only available education for Shevchenko when he lived in the village. It's a very dramatic part of his life. He became orphaned quite early. When he was 9, his mother died at her 40, being very young. And in 2 years, his father also died. So 11 to 14, Taras was basically homeless without any regular care and had to feed himself. Though he was simply surviving, he abandoned the school, which didn't give him enough knowledge, and went to find a teacher of drawing among the local icon painters. Since his early childhood, Shevchenko was found of peculiar talent in drawing. And his promise as an artist later allowed him to rise out of serfdom and to enter the artistic and cultural circles in Petersburg. But that would be several years later. And before that, the 14 years old Taras Shevchenko was taken to his landlords, to Baron Engilgard's estate, to serve as a kozachok. Kozachok is a Ukrainian word for boy servant. In 1829, Baron Engilgard moved to live to Vilnius, which at the time was the provincial city of the Russian Empire after these partitions of Poland. He took his boy servant Taras with him. Shevchenko was 15 when he had to leave his native land. And since then, he spent most of his life out of his beloved Ukraine. And this is also a sad story. We know almost nothing of his Vilnius period, but we know that his first and quite professional pencil drawing, Head of a Woman, was executed here, and Shevchenko showed a very skillful talent in drawing. And later, in 3 years, seems to be in 3 years, Engilgard again changed his location. He went to live in St. Petersburg, in the capital of the Russian Empire. And of course, he took his serfs with him to St. Petersburg, and Shevchenko followed his landowner. In Petersburg, Engilgard noticed his serf's talent and decided to get some use of his talent. And he contracted a young artist to study ornamental art decoration to have his private craftsman. Shevchenko later came in contact with the society for the so-called Society for the Encouragement of Artists, and began attending its classes, its workshops. At that time, the society started receiving governmental subsidies and had become particularly involved in securing the freedom of artists who were serfs. And it also was a general problem in Europe then when nobility started noticing, started helping common people, the peasants, serfs, etc. It was the influence of the impact of their French Revolution. And later, Shevchenko met the key players in their St. Petersburg cultural life. Many of them were from Ukraine. You remember Kyiv Mahila Academy was closed, and people who were related to science, education, culture, who wanted to lead a related life, they went to live in the capital, in St. Petersburg. So there was a big group of Ukrainians. They were quite influential. They took influential positions, and Shevchenko became acquainted with them. And they noticed Shevchenko's talent in drawing, and he also wrote, by the time he wrote some of his first attempts in poetry. And they decided to release Taras from serfdom and to give him opportunity to study at the Academy of Arts, because serfs were not allowed to get higher education. Shevchenko's landowner Engilgard agreed to release his serf Taras, but asked the sum of 2,500 rubles for his serf.
How much is that roughly today? What does that translate as?
I cannot tell you how it is today, but I can compare to the prices of that. For example, an ordinary serf who could read and could write could be sold for 300, 400 rubles. It was a typical average price for serfs for the times. 2,500 rubles, it was a very big price. I think this is also because Shevchenko had talent, and because people who participated in his releasing were quite famous. Shevchenko's friends, when they heard the sum, they decided to find some influential support and financial assistance, of course, because really the price was huge. And Shevchenko became acquainted with the Russian artist Karl Burylov, who was the most famous artist of his time in Russia. And he had recently returned from Italy, all in fame, with his iconic painting, Last Day of Pompeii. Another person was Vasily Zhukovsky, the Russian foremost poet of the time. And at the same time, he was quite an influential person because he was a tutor of future Emperor Alexander II. Both took an active part in the liberation of Taras Shevchenko from serfdom. How did they get money? Karl Brylov, the artist, painted a portrait of Vasily Zhukovsky, the famous poet and a person close to the Tsar's family, the tutor of their future emperor, Alexander. And they organized auction to sell the portrait and to use this money for Shevchenko's freedom. And the lottery was held among the members of the Tsar's family to raise the necessary funds. They managed to collect 1,000 rubles, and the rest, the missing money, it was 1,500, was made up by Shevchenko's friends. Consequently, in 1838, aged 24, Taras Shevchenko was released from serfdom and he became a free man, only at his 24. And soon after that, Shevchenko enrolled in the Petersburg Academy of Arts, which at the time was the most prestigious institution giving artistic education in the Russian Empire. And Shevchenko's primary teacher was Karl Brylov, or Karl the Great, as his contemporaries called him for his tremendous talent, fame, and popularity. So from the position of a serf, Shevchenko jumped very quickly into position of a student at the Academy of Arts and favorite student of Karl the Great, Karl Brylov.
So that's quite an astonishing rise for somebody who, as you said, grew up as a serf, grew up as a peasant.
And look at this from our position. Yeah, this fact could give Shevchenko a great chance to make a brilliant career as an artist, to earn considerable money, to be welcome in the saloons of the wealthiest aristocrats of the day. Though it was his artistic talent that provided him with the direct means to escape from serfdom and to enter these high top circles of St. Petersburg, among his contemporaries, and even today, he is better known as a poet. Shevchenko began writing poetry when he was still a serf. Having gained freedom, he was working as intensively on his art as he was working intensively on his poetry. And finally, in 1840, when he was 26, his first small collection of poetry, entitled The Kobzar, appeared in St. Petersburg. Kobzar sounds pretty strange for foreigners. Kobza is a folk Ukrainian musical instrument, very old one. Kobzar is a person playing kobza. And kobzars in Ukraine were like bards, like minstrels or troubadours in Europe. They were wandering singers. They would travel from all over the country singing historical songs and dumas, the unique epic forms that reflected the most important events in the life of the Ukrainian people over many centuries. And kobzars also were a source of information about the past and the present. They spoke of the Ukrainian heroes who fought against the enemies or enslavers, about heroes who sacrificed their lives for their homeland and compatriots. They also sang about the current situation in the country, social unrest, national or religious disputes, status accumulation, etc. And Shevchenko's poetry from this collection was very much consonant with the Kobzar songs and with folk Ukrainian dumas, these folk songs. And given the title Kobzar to his collection of verses, the poet emphasized the durability, the continuing process of the Ukrainian old tradition of the past and the literature of his time. On the one side, it was the durability of old tradition of the past, and on the other side, he joined the literary process of the 19th century to the past, folk songs, to dumas, etc. And in the best romantic tradition, we remember he was the poet of Romanticism. The poet sings an ode to Ukraine, its history, its heroic past, etc. Very often people ask, when they see this prints of Kobzar, they ask what was the language of Shevchenko's poetry. The poetry from Kobzar, it acquired the symbolic meaning of the Ukrainian literature revival at the time. Shevchenko wasn't the first Ukrainian poet, and he wasn't the only poet of his time. There were other romantic poets. For example, there was a very strong and famous, the so-called Kyiv school of romanticism, because there was Kharkiv University at that time. Kyiv University appeared a few years later, and Kharkiv was the first university in Ukraine in the Russian Empire. In Ukraine, which was under Russian Empire. In the whole part of modern Ukraine, Lviv University, Lviv was under Austrian Empire, was the first. But Shevchenko's talent was really tremendous, and he could feel the soul of his folk. And in his poetry, he expressed something which was very touching for the Ukrainian people. And also a very important thing, he wrote Ukrainian. Though the collection of Kobzar appeared in St. Petersburg, which was Russia, and Shevchenko lived and worked in Petersburg, so in Russia. His poetry was written in Ukrainian.
Do you have any to hand? It would be good to hear a little bit of what the poetry actually sounds like.
It sounds very much like modern Ukrainian language, like I speak now. It's almost the same. You can understand it without interpretation, because we consider him to be the founder of modern Ukrainian language, of the language we speak now. It's not like you have your Shakespeare, you must adapt to modern, or the language of, what was this guy, Canterbury Tales.
Chaucer, yeah.
Yes. Shevchenko, we must understand, he lived not as far away in time as your first great poets lived. It was only 200 years ago. What was the official policy of the Russian Empire concerning Ukrainian language? When Shevchenko's poetry appeared in Petersburg, were a series of critical articles in Russian periodicals, and all the critics acknowledged poetic talent of Taras Shevchenko. But all of them, in one voice, criticized him for writing poetry in Ukrainian, which was considered to be the peasants' language at the time. Because the Ukrainian language was the oral spoken language of peasants. And Shevchenko took this language for his poetry, and he took the language of his region. This is now Cherkasy. It was Central Ukrainian dialect. This is now Cherkasy and Poltava regions, which, by the way, suffered very much, were Russificated to a great extent during the Soviet times. And he wrote his poetry in this Central Ukrainian language, and this language became later the official language of Ukraine.
So Taras Shevchenko is in St Petersburg. He releases his first book of poetry. He uses the language of the peasants. He writes in Ukrainian, and the reaction is mixed. People, as you said, recognize his talent, but they criticize him for writing in Ukrainian. What happens next?
Next, he comes to Ukraine. He graduated from the Academy of Arts. He got diploma of a free artist, and he went to live in Ukraine. From 1843 to 1847, Shevchenko lived in Ukraine. Ukraine at that time was called Malorossia. It's literally Little Russia, and it was Malorossiyskiy gubernii, Little Russia provinces of the Russian Empire. When he came to Ukraine, he was celebrated as a famous poet and artist. He left Ukraine when he was 15 years old, and he was a serf, and he came back aged 29 as a free man, as a most acknowledged as a most famous poet of his time, and as a talented and educated artist. And he was invited to the estates of the Ukrainian nobility, where he painted their portraits, talked about the past of Ukraine. He talked about the past with these people. Most of them, they were descendants of their so-called Cossacks elite. Cossacks were warriors of the Ukrainian army, and until the end of the 18th century, we had Zaporizhia siege, and we had Hetmanshchina. They were states. They were states. Very much. They were very much autonomic from the Russian Empire, and these states were abolished or cancelled by Catherine II in 1780s. And Shevchenko was born some 30 years after after these states were abolished. In the 19th century, people were very nostalgic about this period because it was the golden age of Ukrainian history. And it was the time when they were free.
I hadn't realised at all that they were so close, that these states had collapsed and then only 30 years later. So people are still talking about them, people still remember them.
Yeah, until I came to work in the museum, I also didn't realize that it was just a few decades from people there were still people who were Cossacks, who remember how to be free. And then they became serfs. They lost their freedom, but you cannot change your mentality within 30 years. Yes, and they still were very nostalgic about this period. And most of Shevchenko's poetries are dedicated to Cossack times. They called it Kozacka Volnitsa, which means, if to translate, Cossack free times. So this nobility in Ukraine, where it was mostly descendants of the Cossack elite, but they lost their identity. They were given privileged, they were given lands, serfs, they had money, and they didn't care. They lost their national identity, I would say. And it was Shevchenko who first applied to them. You guys, you are descendants of such great people. You are descendants of free people, and now you lost all this. And he started talking about this. He expressed these ideas in his poetry. And that was at the time when we had no political elite. This role of the leader, Shevchenko accepted this role of the national leader because of the absence of political class in Ukraine. So he was a member at Kyiv Archaeographical Commission. He was a staff of this commission. He traveled to different regions of Ukraine and executed a series of artworks representing Ukraine. Its landscapes, people, the most important historical moments, national traditions and customs, etc. And he was the first artist to do that in Ukraine. It was very typical for Romantic period to get interested in your country, to represent your folk and to represent the beauty of your country. Landscape is style which appeared in the Romantic period. Before that, landscape served just a mute scene to depict some people or some events on a mute scene. And in the 19th century, landscape becomes a separate style and very influential style in art.
So he becomes a figurehead of sort of Ukrainian statehood, Ukrainian ideas about themselves. People remember the states beforehand. He's writing poetry, he's painting, he's depicting the landscape. All of this leads to the sort of next bit of his life story. Tell us about that.
When he was in Ukraine, he continued writing his poetry. But if to compare this poetry to the previous ones, to the poems from Kobzar, it sounds as if the poet reconsiders the situation, the events, etc. In Kobzar, he was just nostalgic, a passive nostalgic poet. And when he came to Ukraine, when he lived here, he becomes active. He not only feels nostalgia, but he calls for action. He calls for being conscious, for being interested in your past, because it's knowing your past, it's very important to understand what you are now and to build future. He put his poetry, the poetry of that period was very national, sharp, and I would say even revealing. He put down his verses into a manuscript album entitled, we call it Trilita, 3 years in English, because he collected poetry written between 1843, 1845, so 3 years. He put it down in a manuscript album, but no, because he knew that censorship would never let it be printed. From the perspective of the authority, every one of these poems was passionately subversive. They were openly political, criticizing the system, governance, and values of the Russian Empire, precisely as a slave-owning empire, and especially as a regime that has destroyed Ukraine and its freedom. You understand that it would never be published, but even if it was published, he could be punished for that. What is interesting about him, yes, he was Ukrainian, but he criticized not only the empire, but also those Ukrainians who served it and swell its progress. In his poem, To the living, to the dead, and still unborn, my country fellows, my friendly epistle, the poet condemned his countrymen whose inferiority complex made them forget their traditions and customs, renounce their own origins, and serve for the empire for the sake of enrichment and career. And this epistle, this is a big poem which he called my epistle. And this epistle was sent to the Ukrainian nobility. He calls to be conscious, because it is always in all countries. It's always the same. Then the changes begin from the top. So changes begin from elite. And that's why he appealed to elite of Ukraine. And he also wrote among the poems from Trilita, from the collection 3 years, there was one of especially radical content. It was the poem "The Dream." It's a satire on the Russian Empire. And he also wrote satire on the emperor himself, Nicholas I, and his wife, Alexandra Fedorovna. An interesting fact, when Taras Shevchenko was accused of being ungrateful, writing mockery, by writing satire on the Tsar's family, who had helped him to release from serfdom, we remember this auction they took part in, he answered that he wouldn't be a serf if the Russian empress had not established serfdom. It's a very smart answer, and it's very true. When Shevchenko was arrested, the collection 3 years became the prime piece of evidence against him at his inquest. And this book, this album, still bears the prosecutor's notations, penciled vertical strokes next to the offending lines, and the occasional NB, which stands from Latin nota bene, or in English, take note. And we exhibit it in our museum. I remind you that I'm a researcher at the Taras Shevchenko National Museum in Kyiv, and another personal recommendation, visit our museum. We hold over almost 800 originals by Taras Shevchenko.
So you have his album in which his prosecutors are writing, well, this, noting down what they think is offensive, what they're going to prosecute him with.
Frankly speaking, we have a copy of it, but the original preserved. We have another institution in Kyiv. It's called Taras Shevchenko Institute of Literature. And this institute holds Shevchenko's manuscript of his poetry, his albums, first editions, and we hold his artwork, originals, his personal belongings, costume he wore, easel, brushes, etching plates, etc.
So you mentioned in your answer just then about his arrest and prosecution. That's a huge moment in his life, and maybe one of the few things that people outside Ukraine who've heard a bit about Shevchenko know about. So can you tell us about that? What happened? And what did it do to him? Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Do listen tomorrow to hear the second part of our special 2-part podcast on the life and work of Taras Shevchenko. Thank you so much, Lyubov, for your time. We'll hear from her again tomorrow. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.
Тарас Григорович Шевченко. Заповіт. Як умру, то поховайте мене на могилі, серед степу широкого, на Вкраїні милій. Щоб лани широкополі, і Дніпро, і кручі було видно, було чути, як реве ревучий, як понесе з України у синє море кров ворожу. Отоді я і лани, і гори все покину, і полину до самого Бога. Молитися. А до того я не знаю Бога. Поховайте та вставайте, кайдани порвіте і вражою злою кров'ю волю окропіте. І мене в сім'ї великій, в сім'ї вольній, новій. Не забудьте пом'янути незлим, тихим словом.